Hello, friends, and a warm welcome to today's discussion on sustainable fashion marketing, and just general sustainability. And I'm really delighted to welcome a very special guest, Professor Gianpaolo Vignali. I hope I pronounced your surname correctly, Gianpaolo. And so Gianpaolo is a professor of sustainable fashion business at Manchester Metropolitan University, and he's published widely on sustainability related topics. And I know Gianpaolo is very, very passionate about sustainability in general. So I met Gianpaolo during his keynote presentation at University of Bristol. And honestly, this was the highlight of a year for me. This was one of the most impactful presentations I've attended. I've reflected on it so much, Gianpaolo. And I would say probably my sustainability, I don't know, IQ or sustainability intellect was pretty low before that. And after attending it, I've learned so much, and I think my sustainability understanding just doubled at least. So thank you so much for coming to talk to me.
You're very welcome.
Very well welcome. So my first question, Gianpaolo, I read that you have a degree in mathematics. How did you end up researching sustainability?
That's a great question, Rushana. And I'm humbled with the introduction and the comments that you've made to start off this discussion. So mathematics, really interesting point. Really, I've always been a logical person growing up, and as a young child, my father was an international marketing professor. My mother was a lawyer. So when I was at school, I wanted to do the things that I was really good at, which was problem solving. Now, one of the main subjects that got me through the problem solving crave was modern mathematics. My father wanted me to do marketing, my mother wanted me to do law, and as a rebel teenager, I decided when I was old enough to go to university and read mathematics at what was UMIS, the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology. And I got a great sense of satisfaction out of doing that, being presented with very difficult and complex problems in the world sometimes is where you're at your best. And I tend to fall asleep on a problem and wake up in the morning, and my logical brain seems to sort things out and puts things into boxes so that when I do wake up in the morning, there is a sort of a semi-solution that I can then start working on. So for me, mathematics was a release around problem solving, and that's been very much part of my career in the past and my future career is really analyzing problems and trends and seeing how we can come up with some of the real world solutions to combat those. And that led me on to sustainability, really. So, after doing mathematics, I went and did a master's in strategic marketing. So, my father's influence did have a little bit more of a push on the direction of travel where I went to when did my university career. And then after that, I did a PhD on case study technique, a methodological PhD, and it was a PhD by publication. So looking at all the different bits of dissemination or work that I've done previously and combining them together and formatting a PhD around the case study technique, looking at Yin's work and how we can explore that in a marketing and a management discipline. Post PhD, I then took my first role as a lectureship at what was Leeds Metropolitan University, which is now Leeds Beckett University, and very quickly moved on to Manchester Metropolitan University, working in the clothing design and technology department. And now my interest in clothing and my interest in fashion became relevant in the area of marketing and management. So that was my route into the discipline of which I research into. And as we're quite fully aware, over the last 5, 10, 15 years, there's been a strong emphasis on sustainability within the fashion industry. And there's a lot of interesting concepts and stories, very much dictated or pioneered by Marks and Spencer's back in the day with their Plan A strategy. Many other retailers have started to adopt corporate social responsibility practices and lead into the world of sustainability. And now, which is what I'm really excited about, is that there's some very good, interesting policy discussions around sustainability and the fashion industry that I'm contributing to. So yeah, that's a little bit of a background of how I've arrived at this point and why I've got into sustainability from that maths degree.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. How you're coming from the solution focus, like problem solving kind of focused perspective. Um, I mean, there are lots of terms floating around sustainability. So you mentioned corporate social responsibility and now policy making. I do think it's very, very important. We're not just obviously talking, researching about it, but you are contributing to the actual policy making part, right? So, yes, with that in mind, what are the latest, biggest trends? How are we progressing in sustainability fashion?
Well, there's a lot going on at the moment. When we talk about it, to try and unpack the word sustainability, it can mean so many different things. One of the areas that I'm looking at is social sustainability. So looking and seeing how we can introduce different kinds of models into the retail landscape to support additional changes in society. So one of the projects that I'm working on or putting a bid together for at the minute was around trying to engage marginalized children in sport, actually getting them prescribed education, and the long-term benefits of that obviously means a reduction in being involved in crime. There's a reduction on the impact on the NHS in the long run, and the model that we're looking at to facilitate that with marginalized children that don't have a high income as such would be a rental model around using sporting equipment, high quality sporting equipment. So through primary schools, through GP surgeries, sporting activities can be prescribed, and the barriers to stop these marginalised children from actually participating in those types of sports and exercise, the equipment is something that can be readily available through this kind of rental model. Now, you may say, well, surely if they've got to rent it, it's going to cost money. Yes, absolutely, of course it does. But there are other funding streams that will help support that. And it wouldn't just be for marginalised children. The marginalised children would seek the benefit, but it would be a rental model that would be self-sustaining so that those more wealthier consumers from the higher socioeconomic groupings would be able to use the model as a rental facility. And the income generated with that would be fed back into supporting those marginalised children to help them. So that's just one of the ideas that we're working on at the moment. But more generally, when you think about sustainability, there's a lot of changes as well. There's been a lot of regulatory developments. There's been a lot of things happening within Europe with the Supply Chain Act in Germany, the ban of fast fashion within France as well, and the impact that that's having on business. There's sustainability from new innovative materials, new practices, so next generation materials. I'm working on a couple of papers around that now, and how that can be accepted by consumers. But what we tend to find with something around the innovation of next generational materials is that the companies that tend to take those on board tend to be from the luxury end of the market, and there's a bit of decoupling that needs to happen. What's the social acceptance of purchasing something that's next generation made out of plant-based leather alternatives versus an actual leather handbag itself? So there's a whole host of work of how that can be accepted within the industry. And then you've got the whole list of circular fashion, zero waste, second hand, market growth. And there's a whole host of challenges and setbacks that can set you forward as a result of that.
Wow, this is so interesting. So much I want to unpick there. But one thing that I want to add, just from my own experience, you mentioned the rental model. You mentioned the rental model for the sporting kit, and actually, clothes you wear during your fitness activities, they have such an important impact in how you feel during sporting activities. And one might say, oh, you can just go out and, play, or, nothing stops you from being sporty and active. Whereas in reality, you do need that kit sometimes. You do need comfortable clothing to feel empowered, to feel good during doing sports, right? So,
Absolutely, that's quite right. I mean, one of the things that I can relate to quite easily is that on a Sunday, my second job is that I manage my daughter's under 11 girls football team,
oh, wow.
um, and one of the things that I'm faced with quite frequently is that you've got a lot of young girls that come from a range of different backgrounds, that so accessing football boots, it's a challenge, But when you look at accessing football boots for girls, all the football boots that are out there are made for boys. They're made for men. There's no football boots that are specifically designed for the female posture, the female body, the ergonomics of how a female would run, walk, etc., exercise. So what we're seeing there is a lot of injuries, for instance, that are happening within female football because of the type of equipment that they have. So having those challenges of having access to the right equipment, whether it's designed for its use or just merely having access to the equipment when you haven't got the money, is so important. And that rental model is something that I feel very strongly and passionate about that would help facilitate and increase that level of activity.
Yes, 100%. Okay, and the next one, you mentioned initiatives culturally, and I think you mentioned France and fast fashion. And so this is something, one of the things that really made me reflect deeply about the impact the fashion related or clothing related policies could have on societies. So when we discuss this in the marketing unit, the module that I teach, a lot of students say, "Oh, for example, Shein is this big bad wolf in the fashion industry, right? Because they produce and then it's really disposable clothing. They're very cheap. The delivery of these goods, they're also kind of cheap and disposable, have a lot of impact on the environment and things like that." And so that led us to discussing banning fast fashion altogether. And
Yeah,
I remember that you said, actually, if we ban fast fashion, it could impact those people in society who cannot afford better quality fashion, for example. And that taps into our human right for clothing, right?
absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Sean. I think the challenge is that everybody has a right to clothing, and the principles of being quite dogmatic and thinking, right, well, we don't need fast fashion. That's right, but I think that's a long-term solution that needs to be worked around, and there's no right answer to that at the moment. We've got to remember as well, rightly or wrongly, fast fashion provides a huge amount of work, labor. People earn money from being involved with fast fashion companies, and merely just cutting them down and closing them down immediately is not the right solution. And quite rightly, those individuals that cannot afford luxury clothing or clothing that's of a better quality and standard feel like they can gain access to these fast fashion brands, and it is their right to access to clothing. And we don't want to stop that amount of ownership. So there's a whole socially, there's a whole body of work that needs to be done around that. And unfortunately, the only way in which we can do that is if we get those fast fashion retailers around the table and we sit them down, and we try and work through things logically, that we're not about profitability, we're not about margins, we're not about trying to come up with the best new styles every 3 to 4 weeks. It's more about how can we clothe society in a way that's fashionable, that's of a decent quality, but also doesn't harm the resources to depletion, or it doesn't harm the environment that we're all living in. Because let's face it, we're trying to make the world a better place. We're trying to make it better for our generations to come. And quite honestly, we're not doing a good job of that when we look at what's happening at all the COPs, that have happened, and the raising of the global warming, etc., and the 1.5-degree target. We're not doing a very good job of that. So until we get all of the major retailers together with policymakers, talking about all the different types of challenges that we've got with regards to what Baroness Young did around the private UK private members bill that she's putting through at the minute, influencing policy, the supply chain act, what's happening in Germany, and getting the right information to consumers so that they can make those decisions. Until we get those people around the table, we're going to forever be in a position where these fast fashion retailers are going to be allowed to carry on fighting for growth and trying to make as much money as they possibly can.
Yeah, it's very interesting how something I discovered quite recently. So there is something called RLC. It's like it used to be fourth largest salt lake on our planet, and now it's almost completely dried off because 1986, back then, two rivers that feed the sea or the lake were diverted to water cotton crops. And for me, honestly, it was such a shocking information because I used to think of cotton, t-shirt, for example. It's nice and it's natural, it's breathable, it's, all the goodness that you can think of in comfortable, healthy clothing. But actually, cotton as a crop, unless it's organic cotton, takes, it's not sustainable at all. And this was such a shocking information for me. So is it also about educating people about even the natural materials? They can be not very good for environment. Is that right?
I, I think that's a fair comment, and that's a fair point. Natural materials. The example that you've provided there, Rushana, is testament to what negative environmental impacts can happen when you try to change the habitat or the environment of what you're trying to grow. If the region, if the area is not made up for it, then what we see is what happened in the examples that you've provided. But there are one of the things that has started to happen quite recently is that with material science and textile production, what we're finding is that there's more new and innovative ways in which we can grow cotton, for instance. So I'm working with a company at the moment, Cali Cotton, and they are based down south, and they're looking at vertical farms, so very similar to what we find in Holland with the vertical farms of food production. So old, disused warehouses over multiple floors that may have not been used have been redeveloped. So there's positive regeneration in the local economy there. What happens is that we have these farms inside that can be used to grow cotton. But in a more sustainable way. So there are ways in which you can use hydrogels that reuse the water, or you're not using as much water as necessary. The hydrogel releases the nutrients, etc., in the soils. There's very innovative irrigation systems as well. So when you pour the water through, it's then collected and drained through and then reused and recycled. So there's a whole host of innovative techniques that are going on within the industry. 30, 40 years ago, you're quite right. We didn't have those innovative practices, but there's been a huge revolution and a huge growth in looking at these innovative techniques. And when we start looking in great detail of how we can make them better, well, there's a whole host of, can we pick the cotton in a particular way that generates a greater yield? Do we have to use humans to pick the cotton? Could we use a robot to pick the cotton so they could analyze the plant through using algorithms around artificial technology to see whether or not, yes, this plant is actually ready to be picked now. Let's take the cotton from here and only take certain amounts or certain areas of it so that the plant is still given enough time to flourish and grow. That research is taking place. That research is happening. So it's really interesting and exciting time looking at just the whole production process of looking at a cotton t-shirt and how that has evolved over the last 40 years.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear there's some positive movement and it's progressing. It made me reflect though, about this. It's probably like a chicken and egg kind of question. Who starts this? Is it us as consumers constantly wanting new, 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 new? Or is it the brands who promote this? Oh, you need new pair of leggings, you need new color, you need new. I mean, don't you think that the fashion has become a lot more fast-paced?
Yeah, it has, and that's been born out of when we moved into the new millennium and the growth of your fast fashion retailers such as your H&Ms and your Zaras and your Mangos, and it goes on. The list goes on and on and on. How do we change that chicken and egg? I think it has to happen um, from all angles, and this is what I really feel from what I would say a fashion revolution perspective. Not only does it require consumers to become more informed so they can make better decisions when purchasing clothing, and I'm not saying that that affects every single consumer, because we alluded to previously that those from a lower socio and economic grouping would want to still have access to clothing. It's their right, and value retailers provide that access for them. So it's a very delicate balance of how we need to operate. But yeah, it's definitely education. So it's educating consumers. It's also the ways in which that's happening now, where brands themselves start thinking about designing for circularity. So it's okay making a garment, but once you finish with that garment, what do you do with that garment? What's the correct way of disposing it? Can that garment be deconstructed? Is there a way in which we can dispose of that garment in a way? So if you were looking at what we said previously about next generation materials and plant-based leather alternatives, under certain conditions, plant-based leather alternatives, as long as they've not been coated in plastic sprays, etc., under certain conditions, they can decompose in a way so they can return back to the earth, and then we can reuse them in certain ways. So designing for circularity is one, and when we mean that, it's how can that particular garment or that item that you're manufacturing, how can that be deconstructed and reused, or how can we dispose of it in a sustainable way? So that's the brand's responsibility. Also, part of the brand's responsibility is providing that information to the consumer. So then the consumer's responsibility is how can they make better and more informed decisions. But the last thing and the most important thing is to speed up this process is that we need policy and we need the support of governments. We need that impotence of pushing that forward. And it's okay going to your COP committees and having them at all different places, all and signing these pledges. But unless we come up with actual practical policy that's going to change this and actually push forward with it, we're still going to be finding ourselves in this position in 5 and 10 years' time. So let's take a bit of a lead of what like Germany have done with the Supply Chain Act. Okay, France is banning fast fashion. I'm sure there are other ways in which we can do that. How can we make less of a stigma associated to secondhand clothing? Because that's quite a big one for a lot of affluent populations. I won't go and shop in a secondhand store. However, you might not have to be seen shopping in a secondhand store anymore when you've got your online web presence of companies like Vinted, where you can actually buy your clothing secondhand. Nobody knows where you've got it from. So there are a whole host of different packages that can be employed, and this is what I would say is a fashion revolution. It's about education, it's about policy, and it's about consumers taking the power and brands all creating this consistent not consuming this consistent approach moving forward, that we're trying to make the fashion industry a better place.
Thank you. That's very good explanation. And the policy side of it is indeed very important. Something we discuss with students, for example, is why don't governments just ban plastic? And it's like, yeah, quite a complex issue, isn't it, with policy making? So it's not as straightforward usually. You mentioned what Germany is doing with their supply chain act. Can you just tell me a little bit about this? Because I don't know anything.
Yeah, and it's where a lot of direction of travel. So we will probably know this better of talking about this using the term digital product passports. So in a roundabout way, what the Supply Chain Act in Germany is doing for Europe is trying to make the supply chain as transparent as possible. So you know exactly where the fiber has come from, you know exactly who's manufactured the clothing, its distribution, the emissions associated with all of the manufacture and the distribution of that garment. Um, so by detailing it in a way that can be logged easily, we can see quite understandably if there are areas within the supply chain where there could be improvements that are made. And this is becoming law. It's a requirement for Europe. The UK, obviously, we're not in Europe because of Brexit. However, manufacturers and brands in the UK that export to Europe have to comply with these regulations as well. So digital product passports and the recording of that supply chain is becoming really important and will come into force in the next few years. However, the UK is not ready for it yet. And when we look at fashion companies within the UK, SMEs particularly, they represent 80% of businesses within the UK within the fashion realm. It's challenging for them because these SMEs tend to have an owner who would probably work 8 till 6 on the company, Monday to Friday, as an example. They may have caring responsibilities, so they come home, they go and do things at the weekend, or they may be working in the business at the weekend. When are they going to have the time to actually sit down and train and understand how to comply with these regulations and these laws? And it's coming quick and fast. So I'm working with the UK Fashion and Textile Organisation. We're putting a bid in at the moment with the British Retail Consortium as well, looking at developing a package training to see how we can use some of the work that we've done within our research group at Manchester Metropolitan University and say how we can convey that to owners of SMEs so that they're not left behind. They have that opportunity to grow, because with growth they can invest. With investment comes jobs. With jobs comes prosperity. So there's a whole host of challenges that are associated with that itself, and it's making sure that okay, we're not in Europe anymore, but we do need to keep abreast of what's happening over there, because a lot of our businesses are impacted with what happens over there.
Yes, absolutely. So I really like this idea that education is so important. And one thing we're also discussing with my marketing students is that paradox of marketing. And the usual kind of more standard paradox of being, how do you make money whilst caring for the planet, whilst being bringing customer delight? It's three conflicting often things. And how do you balance that? So it's not just profit, it's profit for the planet, for the people, and for the organization. But also the other kind of more, I don't know, maybe smaller or secondary paradox is, if everyone could afford an organic, happy, free range chicken, wouldn't they buy it? But if it's a 25 pounds chicken, right? Not everyone could afford it. And so it's just always bringing it back to education. If more people knew that cotton t-shirt and its implications on nature and on the planet, the more people would consider, shopping more responsibly if they can. And so on this one, part of the education, I was really, really shocked to find out from your talk at Bristol that actually plastic bottles should be recycled into plastic bottles. Gianpaolo, can you just tell us a little bit
Yeah,
why?
yeah,
Why is
absolutely.
it? Yeah.
That's it's a really good one. I mean, there was a major push a few years ago to recycle old plastic bottles, water bottles that we drink in every day into clothing, and this is what we call a little bit that's a bit of greenwashing more than anything because it's okay making clothes out of old plastic bottles, but you've got to ultimately ask yourself the question, what's going to happen with that item of clothing after you've finished with it? It's not made from a great quality fiber. It might not be in the best style or it may go out of fashion. So we could just throw it in the bin, can't we? Or maybe we can put it in one of these bins that we find near a supermarket that you can put your old clothing into that then goes to a charity. All science seems great. Well, but let's unpack that a little bit. If you put your clothes in a bin or to a charity, in a bin they go straight to landfill, and we have the problem of what we find with the Atacama Desert in Chile, where it's become a massive dumping ground for old clothing, in particular fast fashion companies and brands are represented there quite heavily. Or it goes to a charity. Now, back in 2016, I was lucky enough to go and visit Uganda. And when I was down there, what used to happen is that these clothes that went into these recycle bins would all be bundled up in these big cubes, oblong cubes, and they'd be shipped out to different countries around the world, predominantly developing countries. And Uganda was one of them. And whilst I was there, I was walking around one of the markets, and these big bundles of clothing would appear in the market, and they would be bought for very low money by local market holders, and they would unpack and get clothes out of there, and they would sell them on the store. Great idea, absolutely. It's giving people the opportunity to sell clothing, make an income. But the challenge with that is that what was seen very, very shortly after is that the Ugandan textile industry just completely bottomed out. All of these clothes were going to the developing country. They were making an income, but they were just then importing clothes from China to top up the things that at a cheaper rate than what they could have manufactured themselves. So it wasn't a sustainable way of developing the growth within that country. So that's a bit of a challenge with it as well. It's not particularly the right thing. So we go back to the point. If we didn't recycle those bottles into a cheap item of clothing, why not just recycle them back into bottles that can then be recycled back into bottles that can also then be recycled back into bottles? And there's a continuous cycle there. Yes, the quality of what you're recycling will degrade over time, but at least you will get more usage out of them rather than changing it into clothing that might only get used once and then thrown in a bin.
Yes, that's very interesting. Each time we have a local, like a fitness and swimming center, and they have this swimming costume on display that proudly says, "I'm made out of plastic bottle." And each time I look at that, I think, "Ooh, now I know that it's not such a great idea, right?" Okay, I have just two more questions. You talked about the positive movements in fashion industry. So maybe what are the three biggest things that we can say, well, this is the future in fashion, sustainable fashion?
There's a whole host of things. I mean, different kinds of models moving forward. One of them that I would always say is that I've been speaking with a colleague of mine, James Crick, who researches. So James is at Leicester University at the minute, and James works on the area of competition. And one of the things that I would like to see is more competition happening within the fashion industry, and I think there's an opportunity for a lot of growth there. What is competition? Well, in very simple terms, there's a lot of research papers that are out there that you can read about, but it's working essentially in conjunction with your competitors, and creating something together that's better for the whole. So you may be developing something for your sector that's much more better. So if we could get fast fashion retailers to all come together and decide on a policy to move forward or guidelines to move forward for the industry, I think that this would be a real positive thing. So competition is definitely something that's moving forward. Greenwashing, green hushing, these are if we could create policy around that where companies are penalized for, and we've got a task force that can go out there and really get go into depth with, we plant hundreds of trees to offset our carbon emissions. Oh, well, that's great. Obviously, you're doing a great thing there, aren't you? But what's that environmental impact? Does that mean it excuses you from, making as much carbon or releasing as much carbon into the atmosphere as what you're doing? Maybe not. But I think for us, individually as consumers, it's the small changes that we can make. And I think if consumers, as we alluded to previously around education, can make those small changes, I think that would be real positive. I know when I was at Bristol, one of the things I talked about, and please, you should never ask this of anybody, but what's your age? Um, I always start off my presentations with what is your age? And I ask them to write their age down on a piece of paper just at the very top corner. And then by the end of the presentation, when we're really looking at all the different things that have happened, I say, right, and I'll stop. I said, my real age is 43 years old. That's how old I am. But today I'm 63. And the reason why I'm 63 is because my coat, my blazer that I'm working is a 1984 Harris tweed jacket, which is 41 years old. My trousers, I bought them, 5 years ago. So 5 years and 41, that makes 46. My shirt, I bought it 12 years ago. It's very still fashionable, that's what, 50, 58, and then with shoes, they're 2 years old, that's 60, and everything else that you can probably imagine, underwear, that's 3 years old, that's 63. So my clothing outfit for the day is 63. And if us as consumers can dress our age and above, we will be doing something that's right, that's positive. And what I mean by that is that you're less likely to be buying fast fashion, wearing it once or twice and throwing it away, taking care of the garments that we have, having that understanding about reuse, repair, recycle. I think those small changes is what's going to make a big, big difference if we can all do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that exercise about what's your age. I was really devastated to discover that mine was
You don't need to tell us, Rushana.
clothes age, my clothes age, because I was wearing a new like a suit and new I had a new handbag. I almost felt ashamed, honestly, but I really love that exercise. So that takes me to a final question, more on the personal side. What do you do maybe as a household? Is anything, any interesting practices? Maybe do you educate your family and friends around small things that we can do?
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I tend to do I take a lot of fluff from the dryer that when we dry our clothes, and there's so much fluff that can be that's created by the drying of clothes, so the collection of all the tiny little fibers that are being pulled from each of the individual garments as they're being dried. And one of the things that I always say to my kids is that look at how much fluff we've created in a month. Just multiply that by how many families there are just in this town, and then multiply that by how many towns there are across the UK, and very, very quickly you come to tons of fluff that can be just disposed of. And it's an excellent piece of fibers really. So, you can put them in your shoe, you walk on them from, you can create felt, you mat them together. You can use that felt for a number of different activities, like putting them on the bottom of furniture on hard floors, or, you can leave the fluff outside for the birds to come and collect in spring so they can, make their nests. And there's all those kinds of things. Okay, if you've got fluff that's made of plastic fibers, the challenge is that that could then go into the soil and then be absorbed, and that's not a positive thing. But there's a whole host of things rather than it being thrown away. It can act as insulation as well. So small things make a massive difference. The problem is we all have to do them, and when some of us aren't doing them, then it makes it that challenge of trying to problem solve a little bit harder.
Absolutely, yes. Gianpaolo, thank you so much. It was very interesting hearing all this. I've learned even more things about sustainability and sustainable fashion. I really appreciate it. So I think for me, some of the key takeaways are, those small steps and small actions we can all do, hopefully that which will then accumulate over time. Importance of policy, of course, and probably the third one is there's very big essential foundational importance of education and educating everyone around this. But it's not just as straightforward, is it? Thank you so much for coming to talk to me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rushana.